How's that? Is that carrying?
There we go.
No?
Oh,
Marginal?
there we go.
Better? Better, okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, the bio that was rejected, Nicholas kind of alluded to it because I was going to, you know, those bios about like, oh, these guys shown here or been published here, those are so boring. And what I had written him was that, yeah, making reference to my circulation around the Great Lakes in football fandom terms, and I made the point, it's a true story here, that growing up in Michigan, the Lions sucked so bad that I was a Vikings fan, and I rooted for the Vikings, right, in the 70s, right, as a little kid. Then I moved to Wisconsin, and I went through this recovered memory kind of experience of having been a Packers fan before liking the Vikings. It was just a very strange feeling. Anyways. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is, you know, Nicholas said, well, you know, you should keep it kind of basic, because, you know, this is an audience of people who are in a lot of different fields. It's not just art majors, and you know, that people come to this class or this lecture series with a lot of different starting points. Okay, and keep it basic. So I'm going to try to keep this to about, you know, about 40 minutes, and leave plenty of time for questions and elaborate on things through the Q&A. But the announced, you know, the title for this talk, I had to provide it like a year ago when I was booked for this thing. So, you know, the time, you know, the calendar was starting to creep up to 2016, and I went back to the title. I'm like, okay, I gotta, you know, like fill that out. Remember what I was thinking of a year ago when I came up with that title. And I have this sort of a basic run through of these three contradictions that I kind of live within, and that I find art and art making, you know, both my own and that by other people, helpful to resolve, helpful for me to, you know, think through these contradictions. Okay, and these are contradictions that apply to problems of engaged citizenry, you know, like being an informed voter, for example, or being some sort of a political or social activist. Also, just in terms of trying to understand, you know, what are the conditions that we're living under now, okay? So hopefully this will get clarified as I move through it. But first of all, just a couple of slides just to, you know, this is an art thing, and I'm an artist, and I'm going to talk about some ideas that are not necessarily directly art-derived, but I am an artist, and I want to show you, you know, some of my basic ways of working. So this is just a snapshot of my basement, and this is where I produce a lot of my material artwork. And what you're looking at there is a Vandercook SP15 proof press, which I bought from a typesetter, not even a print shop, but a typesetter in like Elk Grove Village, somewhere right near O'Hare Airport, outside of Chicago. And the person I bought it from was the only owner, so it was in very good condition. And he bought it in 1961, which was the year that my father arrived in this country. So I would use this machine and just appreciate the design and construction of this machine, which was made by the Vandercook Company on Toohey Road, north of Chicago. The building's still there. And to me, this press kind of signified a moment in American industrial and economic history that was linked on this very personal level to my own family history. So this is what the bed looks like, and that is some wood type that I've collected over the years, the kind of stuff that I print. This picture of Nicholas Lambert, who somehow occupied my print shop for an afternoon, and we did some printing together. So that's what it looks like to be printing for that. And this is one of the results of in progress printing. It's like you start to stack up these prints for drying in between inkings and runs. Okay. So let's go through these three contradictions that I think all of us really need to think through in order to better understand what it means to be socially responsible or contributing to public dialogue and discussion, grappling with current events, etc. So the first one, place membership versus social membership. Okay, so this is a problem of belonging and the ways that all of us experience and present multiple forms of belonging, right? And I'll explain a little bit of this as I go through these slides. So I could say on one level that I belong to a worldwide population of people who are descended from the people who have lived in this part of the world, meaning China, for millennia, right? And to take such a vast land and population and such a long history, naturally there are going to be different segments and subsegments of that population. So where my family, at least in a traceable form, has come from or through is in this area. So what we're seeing here is, sorry, is there a cursor? Okay, is that showing? Yeah. Cursor? Okay, yeah. So here, right, this is the little detail section. These are just maps that I've grabbed off of the web. So you see the Korean Peninsula here and the Sundong Province Peninsula here, and this is these are maritime sea routes that connect these places across this part of the sea and to Japan over here, and my family is from these cities along here, Yantai, which is right here, and Weihai, and my grandparents moved from this part of China to this part of Korea, which is now North Korea. And over the course of what became known as Korean War, they moved from North Korea to what became South Korea and this part right here, near Seoul and Incheon. Incheon is the port city of Seoul. Okay, and from there they arrived here in the United States. So this diasporic history presents these contradictions of belonging to very specific populations with very specific narratives, but also general populations with kind of a general shared history. And this becomes, it's not necessarily a problem, but it is a complication for one's identity, for one's the way one answers a question of where one is from or to what And all of us have this, right? I'm just telling you like the specifics of my story, right? Now this is a picture of me in Incheon, in the Chinatown of Incheon, Korea. It's a very small Chinatown, totally identifiable as a Chinatown. If you've been to the Chinatown in Chicago, like Wentworth Avenue, there's a gate, over the street. It has one of those, and it's smaller than the Chinatown in Chicago. And this was the center of the Chinese population in the Korean Peninsula. That's where my parents grew up. Now I'm just putting this one in there because this is a monument that's in the Chinatown. A monument to a particular Chinese Korean dish, which is this type of noodle. Okay? It's in Korea. It's the food that Korean people go to Chinese restaurants to eat. Okay? So first example of a way of negotiating these complications of history, personal history, social history, geopolitical history, through in this case a fairly simple artwork. So this was a screen print that was made out of a drawing that I did in a hotel staying in Yantai after a day spent in one of the ancestral villages from which my family comes from. Okay, when you study Chinese history, you always read about villages and village life and village rural populations and peasantry. But in present-day China, unless you have a guide, unless you have a personal connection, it's actually kind of hard to go to a village and be introduced to a village. Like village life is fairly insular. And I went to this village where I had these kind of distant family connections, and I met up with a distant cousin, and we took a walk around this village. Very small. It took us like 40 minutes to go around the entire perimeter, and it was kind of the square sort of layout like this. So this is what I imagined it might have looked like from the air. And you go there, and half of the village is gone, empty, depopulating. And there's 10,000 villages in China, all over the country, that are undergoing this process of depopulation, moving to the cities, big, urbanization of the population. So all the young people in this village are leaving, and then I started to place myself into that narrative and think like, well, this is kind of peculiar that somebody like myself, who was born and raised in the United States, would, quote unquote, return to this ancestral village and be one of the few people who would make it a point to go to this village as opposed to leaving, right? And so there's two elements here that I'll just point out that for me in that moment in the hotel trying to process what I just experienced, these came into my mind in an artwork. You can just put these things together on a piece of paper or in a drawing and see what connections might arise, or see what kind of a poetics might arise, which then is a matter of not simply logical connections, but also just a total aesthetic experience, or suggestive vectors, the kinds of questions or associations one might have from looking at something that doesn't quite make linear sense, right? So this right here, looking for a way, that's a fragment from a Gil Scott-Heron tune, goes, looking for a way out of this confusion, rivers of my fathers carry me home. It's Rivers of My Fathers, Winter in America, that's the album, go listen to it, right? Okay. And this Chinese character, which is Chai, it means to tear apart or to dismantle. And in China, not so much anymore in the first tier cities because they've been entirely rebuilt, but about maybe like 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, there'd be vast swaths of urban space where you'd see this character spray painted on buildings that were condemned. And you could see that like for a whole neighborhood that, the authorities decided to flatten the village and rebuild it, right? So this character assumed through the boom of the economic boom of China, the urbanization, kind of status of this like icon about like erasure of space. Not so much applied, and you don't see it so much in villages though, right? So that's part of why I put this in the village, because the villages they're depopulating but not being rebuilt. So this is one way for me to think through these contradictions. Okay, but to go further, right? So I'm not from China, right? I'm from Michigan. But what does that mean? As Nicholas said, I live all over this like Great Lakes region, and unlike a lot of people I've grown up with, a lot of people I've known, people I run into, who maybe haven't lived in various different parts of the region, like I think about the region as one region as opposed to like separate states. Now this is a problem of inherited territories. Like what I mean by that is, so this is just an image I grabbed off the web of population centers around the Great Lakes. But you see in the gray lines, the outlines of the states. So this presents a problem, right? Because there are so many forces at work and so many currents that go in different directions that don't respect state borders. And for that matter, don't respect, for example, municipal boundaries, like the city limits of Milwaukee, for example, right? People move in and out of Milwaukee. There are lots and lots of flows of things that go across all of these borders. But the governance and the system of laws and administration that we have inherited, that existed before any of us here were born, are these city limits, these borders. These are what we have to work within to solve problems that don't respect those city limits and delineation of space. Right? And for me, an interesting way of thinking through this problem of what we've inherited is to go back even a little further to the time when those lines were being surveyed and being defined, and space was being carved up into the administrative units that we all have to live with now. So these are 4 of the places that I've lived in and around the Great Lakes. And to go further into original names or names from the time when the encounter between settlers and the indigenous peoples was new and fresh and not quite so defined yet, you can see these interesting commonalities of how places were named and how people thought of space, right? So to bring in another kind of example of an artwork that helps to think through these problems of regional space. Here is a detail of a map that one of my collaborators, an artist named Mike Wolf, came across. It's a hand-drawn map drawn by kind of an outsider map maker, an untrained map maker named Paul Durand, who sort of had this lifelong hobby of researching native place names around where he lived. He lived in Faribault, Minnesota, which is about an hour south of Minneapolis. And this was one of the large, this was it extends far beyond what you see on the slide here. But what you see at the center is the confluence of the Mississippi, it's right here, Mississippi, and the Minnesota River here.
present-day Twin Cities, right here. And yet, unlike a pure compendium of native place names, he's included right at the center there, Fort Snelling, which of course was a military fortification brought in by the settler American forces. So combining, first of all, let's just say that the native peoples did not represent space in this way, right? Top-down, bird's-eye view of a piece of land on a two-dimensional paper surface, right? So that alone kind of brings this representation into a present day. But then also, putting in something, these names like Fort Snelling, or for that matter down here, from the French explorer, right there. This person, Paul Durand, is mashing up the native place names with some of the post-settler encounter names as well, which to me then becomes a kind of provocation. It suggests to me, well, what might all of this region look like or be called, in the distant future? Maybe one of these days, and we have to have the kind of the freedom and courage to imagine something like this. Once the delineations of space that we've all inherited, no longer exist, when they finally eroded, when we finally abandon them, then what will this part of the world be called? How will it be represented? Maybe it'll be represented in something like this. Okay, 2. Okay, so carbon, capital, and climate. Just go through real quick here. These three ways of thinking about space and scale and our inherited conceptions of space and scale not serving us well anymore. So it's clear when we look at these three things, the hydrocarbon economy, oil, fossil fuels, capital and climate, meaning capital meaning both capital, primitive accumulation of resources, but also and especially the flow of money, capital that's measured and denominated in dollars or euro or yen, and of course with climate. This is when it becomes very obvious that we live in a borderless world and maybe always have, right? So here's a very concrete illustration of that. This is pipelines across North America, transnational networks of delivery of liquid crude oil, delivery of natural gas. The part that's not shown here is the alternative transport system, which is by rail over land. And that's a kind of similar situation where something's extracted from here in this remote part of this country and transported, delivered to the next stage in its processing in another part of a different country. Right? This is off of the website for Olanda, which is a foreign currency trading software. If you're talking about borders and the circumvention of borders, we have to talk about the advent of electronic trading. And this is something that happens 24/7, people on their screens, making money basically through a system of legalized gambling, right? And these are instantaneous transactions. These are markets that are virtually open all the time. And these are completely global markets. You can be anywhere where you can get online and do this activity. Okay, this is a more detailed example the erosion of borders in the service of trade, in the service of the movement of capital, and in the service of business. So this is a map that was put together by an artist collaborator of mine, Rosalinda Ortila, who is a Chicago-based artist. And this is just a research project of hers where she got very interested in what are called foreign trade zones, FTZs. And these are parcels of land that are chartered through a quasi-governmental agency and then registered to belong to a category of land, a zone that's fenced off, within which favorable tariff rules apply that don't apply on the outside of that fence. And these are designed to eliminate trade barriers, namely tariffs, when you're actually moving stuff in and out of the country. Okay? When you're offloading something from a ship, you've got to put it somewhere, and that somewhere has to be a place for the purposes of easing the tariffs that would otherwise be applied to it. A zone that is defined as, say, for example, a tariff-free zone. Okay? And these are places in and around Chicago that are that have that status. Okay? Something that you could drive by 100 times and never notice. Maybe look into it and there's just like, shipping containers, and it just looks like your average kind of, sort of light industrial sort of holding zone or something like that. But if you come up to these fenced off areas, you can see the sign, like the keep out, but also, entering in a different jurisdiction, something that is managed and governed according to rules and laws that are not those of the municipality that surrounds it. Okay, so while there's all of this flow and circumvention of borders and border controls, we also have at the same time in this world of ours now a whole lot of friction. There's a book by Anna Singh, an anthropologist who has written a kind of a highly regarded book studying these points of labor flow or capital flow or the flow of resources where what she calls friction, like labor unrest or other kinds of events or tendencies that will disrupt that flow. And this is something that is kind of the flip side to all of this increasingly fast circulation. So, for example, in China, even though China, until kind of like now, for maybe the last 20 years, it was really like the factory to the world, making all of the sort of the cheap goods. What's also happened in that period is a kind of not very well publicized for because Chinese government does not want to publicize this, and because the American media doesn't really pay attention to it. But a lot of rising labor unrest, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of labor rebellions, you could call it. So here's outside of a Walmart in China, right? The workers, right? This right here, right? We want to work. We want to make a living. That's really kind of how that's translated. It's kind of like we want to live, or we want to have a life. That's sort of the translation of This just happened a few weeks ago in the Bay Area. These kinds of actions by, citizens who have grievances. This is a Black Lives Matter action where they shut down one side of the Bay Bridge, which if any of you who have been to the Bay Area and driven around there, this is the primary conduit of traffic between the East Bay and San Francisco. So in San Francisco, and then across the bay, you have these population centers of Oakland, Berkeley, further out, Richmond, Walnut Creek, and to shut down traffic on that bridge is really, a kind of a pretty literal sort of a case of friction. Right here in Wisconsin, of course, we have this kind of agitation that's been going on since 2001. The group, Overpass Light Brigade, headed up by a faculty member here, Lane Hall and Lisa Moline, people I worked with when they were young faculty and I was a graduate student. Just trying to disrupt the political process to the degree that just messaging could maybe do that. Right? Okay. An example of, from just very slow level sort of project, I don't think I've ever talked about it in a lecture. It was just something I did for a Facebook photo album. What I did was I just set very quickly this poster and printed it. Imagine taxing the rich. Okay, and I just put it on my Facebook page. Yeah, I printed like 35 of these. Whoever wants one, I will mail it to you. But send me back a photo of you having put it up somewhere, and so I can see the place context or the surroundings, right? So a bunch of people said, oh yeah, send me one. Here's one that went to Lauren Berlant, who is a cultural critic, a very interesting intellectual, works at the University of Chicago, and she put this up on the campus of the University of Chicago, in the business school of the University of Chicago, which if you know about free market ideology, the Chicago school was really where the place from which that Milton Friedman, led philosophy of markets equaling freedom really came to prominence and eventually influence lots of public policy, right? So she put this up right there. Another friend of mine worked in he worked in a big law firm that was in the Sears Tower. This he slapped up onto a window on the 75th floor of the Sears Tower, right? This is in Indianapolis. This is in Brooklyn. Just right there. Okay. This is in Kansas City. So to me, it was kind of an experiment in seeing where these things would end up, and then imagining, local people, passersby, whoever who are the people that would see this thing, and then centralized in my Facebook wall, right, in an album where people could go through these. All right. This is a mansion on the shores of Lake Superior up in Ashland. Okay, so the last one I'll go through right here is just the contradictions of art and politics of art, and all of the questions having to do with how does art fit into a political analysis or a political campaign, and the converse, how politics fitted into art practices, into languages of art. Okay? And this was kind of the way I phrased it for today, right? Just to highlight the fact that for much of what is legitimized institutionally as art exists as at one and the same time as a commodity, something that is traded as if it were a carrier of monetized value, something that you could put a dollar figure on, and that would change in value in dollar terms. Right? It's very difficult at a certain level in the art world and even in the philosophy of art now to work outside of that. Okay. That being said, there is space, and there are lots of examples of artists who can come out with like really interesting political statements and still have that work be, operating as a commodity. So, an example, somebody else's example, is work that I saw this summer, made by this guy named Jeremy Deller, who is a UK artist with a great research-oriented practice. He does a lot with like archives, and he sort of revisits histories and makes installations and displays out of that. So, very interesting work that he did for the Venice Biennale this year, called "The Shit Old Days," right? And so I don't know if you can read that, right? He's excavating an archive, right? These archival photos by William Clayton, right? And these are a kind of a forgotten cache of photos that documented in this sort of like portrait form, sort of a frontal posed portrait form of these working people, many of them female, from a period of 19th century British industry. Okay? So here's pictures of them. So this is how they were on display. So the twist to his installation here that was interesting and kind of conveniently circles the whole idea of this of labor and labor conditions is what you see up here, right? This protrusion from the wall, which is this like mannequin arm with this Motorola device attached to it, which is an actual labor regulation device that's attached to the worker's arm in warehouses where people are moving stuff around and sorting goods and readying things for shipping, right? So you can read that yourself there. A kind of brave new world that is upon us now, and that brings to light the fact that these problems of labor and management and how to extract as much value from the labor as possible, forms a continuum between, the shit old days and the shit new days. Okay, so the second example I'll put out here, and this one I'll go into some depth, where an art practice allows for the creativity and the space to help resolve these contradictions to the degree that we might actually enable ourselves to freshly approach these political problems in a way that's, once in a while, actually effective. Okay? So, calling attention now to a group that I've worked with, that Nicholas has worked with, called TAMS Year 10. TAMS was, I should say, a correctional facility, a state-run correctional facility at the far, far, far southern tip of Illinois. Those of you from Illinois may know this, right? Illinois is an extremely long north-south state. It's like a 7-hour drive or something from Chicago all the way down to TAMS. And this group of artists in Chicago were concerned about this facility because it's a so-called supermax facility, meaning all of the units are isolation units where the inmates are kept in 23.5-hour complete lockdown inside. And then they go outside into a confined courtyard with no view except for directly overhead for outdoor exercise. And people were confined in these solitary units at this point, by the time TAMS came to the attention of these activists, for years on end. Now, this is all counter to the stated practices when TAMS was first opened. Right? It was opened with the stated rationale of, well, we have a segment of the prison population that are so intransigent and so heinous in their psychopathology that we need to have these kinds of, we need to have a whole entire facility that's just dedicated to this kind of secure, almost all the time, solitary lockdown. So these artists in Chicago didn't, how do you even approach this problem? How do you even engage with this, right? It's a fairly imposing problem to even think through, especially if you're just a ragtag bunch of artists who are all, shoestring budgets, people who are adjunct, teaching in places and just scrapping to get by, trying to get their careers sort of, going. Well, they did something that was just kind of like, a last resort. Like, I can't think of anything else to do. What are we going to do? We're going to write letters to these inmates. And we're going to send them poetry. We're going to have just as a focal point, right? Something to do, right? So they would send these inmates poetry, and through that process, developed relationships with these people, and then they did some, some slightly more pointed projects. Like they did a project where they polled the inmates. They just sent the inmates like a card, just saying, "Hey, send us back." They asked them like 3 questions, 3 simple questions. And one of them was like, that I remember was like, "What do you need right now?" I forget the other 2, but they were like kind of open-ended questions, and they would come back, and some people would write really long answers. It was like, well, what do I need? Some people would write short answers. I need more toiletries and more phone cards. Or another person would say, I need to know what my daughter is doing now because I haven't seen or touched her, since she was 6 months old, and now she's 19 or something like that, right? Something more profound and poignant. Okay, out of this grew many different aspects of what gathered steam as an actual campaign to educate the public, to bring this facility to the awareness of people, taxpayers, who may not even, didn't even know that it existed, right? So this picture is from a campaign, part of the TAMS Year 10 campaign that was headed up by Mr. Nicholas Lampert, based on a technique that was more or less invented by a person who was a student at UWM at the time, named Jesse Graves. who was a student who worked with Nicholas, called mud stenciling. That was the technique that it was their innovation, and it was a really smart, really clever, really low-tech, accessible way of putting messages and images out in the public in a way that was that skirted the line of what's legal, what's allowed. It's not spray paint, it's mud. It's going to wash off after some rain, but if there's no rain, these mud stencils have tremendous staying power. And they were kind of a spectacle in terms of how they were applied in public. This was on the plaza in front of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. So, with a great kind of public audience. The part of the TAMS campaign that I contributed to was this one, where one of the principals of the organization, Lori Jo Reynolds, who is an artist activist, was thinking about these iconic civil rights photographs from the Memphis sanitation workers' strike of 1968, the labor campaign that Martin Luther King went down to Memphis to support, and that's where he was assassinated, right? Out of that struggle came some of these iconic photographs, right? This is a photograph by Ernest Withers, and that has become like sort of part of the iconography of the civil rights movement. Some artists have taken this "I am a man" sign and done other projects with it. Right? So here's one of the actual signs in framed in an archival setting. This is in a library at Wayne State University in Detroit. That's where I saw that. This is an artist named Dred Scott, who does these provocative performances, and this is what he did. He walked as a one-man march through the streets of Harlem wearing this sign. And his point was, 47 years after having asserted that, we are men, I am a human being, right? That we exist. We must be acknowledged. That now, if you look at, police violence and, the impunity that some of the police brutality is allowed, well, actually, maybe it's more applicable to wear a sign that says, "I am not a man." So that was his thing. Another artist, Hank Willis Thomas, he just did all these different riffs, right? Man, I am, be a man, I am your man. Right? So the TAMS Year 10 campaign, what we did was the I Am a Mom campaign. And this was one of the parts of the campaign that involved, at a very intimate level, parents of those who are incarcerated at TAMS. And at some point in the TAMS Year 10 organization, the families of the inmates became very centrally involved in some of these actions. And I printed these signs out for them. And we would do these sort of visible news conferences with these visuals. So like this is, for example, that's a placard that I printed. But the I Am a Mom campaign, it was like a portrait and image messaging campaign where the mothers of these men incarcerated would hold these signs, including in this sort of like a photo booth kind of project where pictures of all the men of TAMS, and then as many of their mothers as And Tamsier 10 is now closed. There was a lot of lobbying of legislators and other elected officials who helped make that happen. But it's really, I think it's safe to say that this also just would not have happened without the Tamsier 10 campaign. So this is really a historic victory, and I cannot think of any other example where an institution as well capitalized and as politically supported as a prison were actually shut down. The way it was shut down was not by people picketing in front of it or doing civil disobedience in front of it, but doing the messaging, as I showed you, and doing the lobbying so that at some point in a state budget, they wrote it out in the budget. That's the only way that something like that can shut down. Okay, so that was just, that is a story that still remains to be told in terms of history of political art. So that is my basic talk. Now I've got a whole lot of slides after this just to bring up in the course of elaborating on questions. And that's what I am ready to subject myself to now. Your probing, critical questions. They don't have to be probing and critical. They can be, they could be, whatever. I'm an open book.
What kind of work did you do as a student when you were here? How did you get started? The more political activist work?
Well, I was always interested in politics, and I like my political education started in high school, and my first big fight was with my parents when I refused to register for the draft as an 18-year-old, and the notice came to my house, and my parents opened it and were like, "You're late, you're 18, you need to be responsible now. You can't let this go, And I was like, well, I'm not going to register, and I've already thought this through, and I became the first sort of big, sort of open split between myself and my parents, which George W. Bush healed. Because my parents were Republican donors, and they were in Michigan, that part of Michigan. If you're following the Flint water situation, the Attorney General of Michigan, Bill Schuette, who's whatever, there's so many problems with Bill Schuette, but he was a friend. He was like an associate of my parents. So I knew a lot of the, as a child, I met a lot of these, what is now like a Republican establishment in Michigan. And my parents, after the George W. Bush administration, they were kind of, they couldn't go there anymore. They thought it was so bad. But to answer your question, when I came here to go to school, I told the print club this in the afternoon. I came to grad school with a set of questions that I wanted to investigate, and I had the discipline to leave everything else aside. So even though I was interested in all sorts of, not just political things, but more, much more like poetic kinds of experimental art making as well. What I came here to study and really explore were questions of identity and how what I had thought about as in sort of elementary form, as conclusions about identity, how they fit into larger currents of what is Asian American history? What is Chinese American history? So I had this fourfold sort of lens. It was like Chinese history, Asian history, Chinese American history, and Asian American history. It's like, okay, take a question or a problem and kind of answer it through those four lenses, and then try to figure out what that meant. So when I was here, all the work that I made had these like Asian or Chinese American motifs, bits of language. I had gone to China in 1993 and for 8 months, and my language was pretty bad at that time. So I was really, observing a lot of Chinese society as a real outsider perspective. But it was before the economic boom, so it was like people riding bikes. I was living in a place with no hot water. It was like kind of close to the ground, kind of old China, closer in lifestyle, closer in the cityscape to revolutionary China than it is to modern present China. So that's what I worked on when I was here. And when I left, when I was done with grad school, I was like, okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm not going to use those motifs now that I'm going to be making work for public. And that was a question for me, because it was like, there's an Asian American scene, and there are there are artists who make all their work about those identity themes. But I had all these other concerns that I wanted to get to that didn't necessarily have a direct tie to identity. Anybody else? I'm sorry.
So Dan, you talked about the general problems and challenges of art and activism. Can you describe a little bit about your own daily art activist practices? What do you do in terms of what you choose, what media do you choose, who you work with, what are you engaged in now?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of failings, a lot of non-productive tendencies on what you could call broadly the left, right? I mean, the whole history of the left globally is a history of failure. So there's lots and lots of starting points that could be had to critically evaluate the analysis of any number of what you could broadly call a left project. So you could look at the civil rights history and think through, like, well, what happened? What happened to the civil rights movement? Like, why? Where did it end? Can anybody here in this room, like, say, when did the civil rights movement end? Because, many people with like a sort of a cursory examination, might have a decent argument for dating a beginning. Maybe you could say Brown versus Board of Education. Separate but unequal. That opened something that then became, sort of wedged into the whole society, that a movement filled in various, lots of ways for the next 10 years. But then, what happened? Right? When Martin Luther King was assassinated? Okay, maybe, but I don't know. Maybe something was already going on before that. Or it was with civil rights. We all know civil rights movement was more than Martin Luther King. So why, what happened, right? So a lot of my engagement is like I contribute labor to like campaigns, in various ways. Sometimes making signs, or flyers or posters, as an artist who has that kind of training. But other times, like in relation to what happened here in Wisconsin in 2011, what I mostly did was report on what was happening, because I lived in Madison, and there were people, lots of people that I knew outside of Madison and outside of Wisconsin, who were wondering, like, well, what was going on there? What's happening? For that moment, my role became something of a, kind of like a critical journalist, or sort of, I was describing and commenting on the things that were happening at the Capitol, sort of as they unfolded, because I didn't see that many other people doing that. And certainly there wasn't anybody doing that for an art audience, which is the people that would pay attention to what I would have to say about it, right? So, I've always tried to be engaged on that sort of grassroots level of actually doing the work that's required for organizing, like getting on the phone or writing the emails or putting up the Facebook event page to act, to make some event happen. So somebody has to do that, and it's a skill, to be an organizer at that level. But also, I do it because it gives me a window into like, well, why is this group so dysfunctional, right? Why is it that, we can't agree on, like a priority, or, some people just, like why do some people or myself have a certain hang up about like, this one aspect of what we don't agree on, so therefore it keeps us from doing everything else. It's important to be engaged so that I gain some insight into, those kinds of dynamics. Within these kinds of grassroots groups.
Thank you.
So you mentioned like political concerns and then the place membership. Is there other things you've explored through your like art practice? You mentioned
That I've what?
like explored in your art. Like you said, after leaving school, you kind of went away from the identity stuff. Like what else did you explore?
Yeah. So every artist of color has this problem of like how you don't want to be just thought of and therefore like curated or included in shows and in collections, that are themed like, oh, Asian American, right? There are organizations that are like, oh, Asian American cultural organization, Asian American theater group, Asian American poetry circle, right? And the people who operate in those worlds, for them, it's a double-edged sword, like, because they're like, they want to have a wider audience. They feel like I'm an artist, right? I'm speaking to universal issues, and people of any background should get something out of my poetry, and yet, but maybe they're only getting invitations, they're only getting paid, by going to an event that's themed, an Asian American something, right? And I also was, careful about that. And that's why, like, after I left grad school, I was just like, okay, I'm just going to leave all of those themes, motifs, visible, like, recognizably Asian kinds of elements. I'm going to leave those behind, right? I'm not going to foreground those in my work, okay? But I'm still interested in identity politics and how identities are constructed, how identity formations like can become political formations, okay? So for me, the way that I still stayed engaged in that whole discourse was by writing about African American artists and politics and cultural politics. So, I've written about and collaborated with, a few African American artists who, have, become kind of like close collaborators, sounding boards. So I write about their imagery and the way they were negotiating race as a way to obliquely, make my arguments about identity and identity formation without, only identifying with what, is visibly like my community, right? My, in quotations, community in quotations, right? So that's the way I did it. And that then, of course, it opened me up to, thinking about people doing work like Dred Scott, like Thomas, these people.
Are there like any less like serious subjects that you like to cover, just like for yourself, or like in free time?
Yeah, I feel like I should apologize at this moment because, like in the print club, presentation or sort of casual run through, I think it was, you know, a little more obvious that, you know, I'm invested in revealing absurdities and even making bad jokes, or it's very. This is going to sound serious again. This is a problem, but it is important to to make work that is funny, right? I think it is, anyways. Not sure I have any slides of fun things up here. I'm sorry. But yes, I mean, to me, you know, let's say for the, about the political thing, like I've been so close to political debates and histories that, I mean, on some level I've detached from it all. You know, it's become the world I work in, and sort of people will call on me to write something or ask me to put an opinion or an analysis out there because, they're kind of confident that I'll be well-informed about something. But that being said, it's like for me to maintain interest and sustainable interest in all of these very serious, what we could even call, crisis kind of situations that are upon us now. It can only happen if you see the absurdity in it all. I think it's one thing that for me that's been interesting and valuable about making trips to China, because for anybody who's been to China, spent a lot of time in China, this goes, I mean, through the whole revolutionary period and certainly into the present day. Just everyday conditions are so surreal, and the way that popular culture is evolving, where people just appropriate forms and vocabularies, and you go to China and you'll see things that I maybe recognize as a Western construction or an American, like a quotation of an American cultural form of some sort. And it's so out of context and so naively recombined that it's just hilarious or weird or funny or ridiculous. And yet, in China, everything really is suffused with a politics at some level. So that's one of the reasons why I've stayed engaged with making trips and making connections with people doing stuff in China and living in China. Because it helps me, it reminds me, or just refreshes a sensibility for this absurd world.
So you were talking in your piece, in your lecture, about friction between opposing views and other sorts of climate thinking people, things like that. Do you feel like in your work you are, since you're working with things like with the government and other sorts of organizations, do you feel like you are creating more friction, or do you feel like your work is trying to kind of create this collaboration between them that really helps the community, I would say?
Well, the concept of friction is valuable to me because I see where it can be a kind of friction that disrupts the flow of the accumulation of wealth and the concentration of wealth that's so one-sided now, and any little bit of friction can help slow that down. As well as, on an existential level for the people, the players who are creating that friction, it's, an assertion of their existence, which without that friction would otherwise be completely, not recognized. So on that level, yeah, I think that, some of the campaigns that I put myself in and contribute to, I'm doing with the hope of building that friction to the point where maybe that flow might even stop and have to adjust itself somehow. Hopefully in favor of the demands laid out by the people creating that friction. Another way to think of friction is, I have a old friend who's he's a software engineer, pretty high level. He's like a senior architect at Apple, and he's also he's got labor consciousness. He's got a whole history as an activist as well. And he was telling me that he had this idea. You've all heard of like a Kickstarter, right? Kickstarter, right? Group fundraising, right? Over the web, right? In the old days, back when organized labor actually had strikes, like I grew up in Michigan in the 70s, you heard about strikes all the time, right? They happened, not totally frequently, but it was a fairly common thing that when a union would, threaten to strike, until their demands were made. Now, the big unions and like some of the European unions, they still have this. They have a strike fund, right? A portion of your dues, of the member dues, would be collected in a fund that was secret. You wouldn't make it public of how much is in this fund, and that was saved to support the members if they did go on strike. So if the union called a strike, the bosses, the management, the owners, they had no idea how long the strike could last because they didn't know how much was in that fund. So the union would dole it out to their members so people could buy food and keep on living, right? But the strike fund was like, you didn't know how much it was. So this friend of mine, he was like, wow, what we were talking about, transnational labor, like, well, like to really heighten the friction, what would really have to happen is like, well, people in this one port here in Long Beach, California, where all these shipping containers are coming in, they would have to go on strike at the same time as these people in Thailand at this garment factory, and these people in Turkey at a textile mill, and have it coordinated across like 3 continents and 3 different companies, 3 factories, all at the same time. So it's one supply chain. Okay. So we were thinking like, well, how would that work? And he said, well, there should be, somebody could write. I could write. He said he could write. He could write an app in 2 weeks. He was like, I could do the back end in 2 weeks. A strike starter. Smartphone. There's 1 billion smartphones on the planet now. 1 billion. Okay. Web-enabled devices with an app. Everybody you could just contribute like $1 at a time around the world to one fund. Okay. And that could be a fund that could be like, okay, just disperse to these like strikes in like 3 different places globally. So he was like, this is a way that we could eliminate the friction. The friction that, the friction of language, the friction of like time zones, the friction of, like 3 places in 3 different parts of the world coordinating a labor action. That's really hard to do because people can't talk to each other, they speak different languages, you have different local conditions, like how are you ever supposed to have that happen? If it happens, it's just by coincidence. It's not by anything organized. But he was like, well, with smartphones and an app, like you could reduce the friction in that way.
Dan, let's take one more.
Okay.
What students? Are there any students that want to, I can save mine, I can ask you later. I'm just thinking the Florida student. Maybe? I was just gonna ask about your research process. I mean, obviously, you're reading a lot and you're writing a lot. You also, you have a schedule, like where are you collecting and your repository for all of these ideas? Where do they take form in different?
Research method, yeah, very, very, I mean, very, two things. Very text heavy, of course, a lot of reading, and then a lot of traveling as well, and going to places, and you know, having the wherewithal to figure out a way to be, you know, like hosted or guided, you know, once I'm there, if it's a place that I don't know, so as to, you know, get a window into that place. That could be through family connections, like, you know, like when I was talking about the village that I visited in Southern Province, or it could, you know, there's been times when it's grown organically. Like, for example, the Austrian government is very, you know, by American standards, very, very generous cultural funding and support for the arts. One of the programs of the Austrian government is they maintain artist studios in a number of countries that they will provide a grant to an Austrian artist to go to for, you know, at the time I was these people, it was 6 months at a time. So somebody would apply for a grant to go to the Austrian artist studio in Chicago, which I'm not sure if it's still there. But it was right there on Milwaukee Avenue, Wicker Park, great location. And you know, every 6 months there would be artists who would go there and do whatever they did, you know, painting or video or whatever. And when I lived in Chicago, there was an artist team who were very interested in all of these kinds of like activists and like more socially engaged kinds of works. And you know, I got to know them and you know, hung out a lot and became friends. And then when they went back to Austria, they organized a symposium and they, you know, got governmental money to fund that symposium. And they invited me over, so you know, I didn't have to pay. And once I was there, then Vienna is it's not that big a city, and the art scene is, you know, pretty small, and everybody knows each other. And I was there for the symposium, so you know, lots of people from that art scene were in attendance. So I met all these people. I ended up going back to Vienna 4 times, and you know, I had never been interested in Vienna, right? So and then became interested, like, oh, well, Vienna is like, you know, this city of like, well, that's where Freud developed his, you know, all his theories about psychotherapy. You know, it's a socialist city. It still is a socialist city. You know, it's a city on the edge of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and there's lots and lots of people, you know, coming there from the former Yugoslavia. It's got this interesting migrant politics within the city. It's got a very interesting relationship to the rest of Austria, which is very conservative. So, you know, that became like kind of like this research interest of mine, right? Just because I went there a number of times, got to know people. And so that was an example of sort of an organic kind of evolution of an interest in a research direction. But I guess that's what I'm here to do as an alum, somebody who, you know, went to school here, is to really encourage, you know, all of you students to, you know, really go out there and you know, be as adventurous as you can afford, and you know, take the risks, because you know, if you have good grounding in the language of art, you know, oftentimes taking those risks can pay off in really interesting, unexpected ways that take your life and your work in you know, very productive direction.
Dan,
So thank you
so much. Dan got so smart because he